Hey, everybody. It's the Line Podcast. I'm Matt Gurney. Jen Gerson is here with me.
This week, we are discussing how Trudeau is in big trouble. He's facing the three C's: Carney, the carbon tax, and costumes. Further, the CBC is bringing its best country club get up to a parliamentary cage fight. And lastly, the latest in the Middle East.
All this and more on a very cheerful episode of the Line Podcast. Well, we've promised people, Jen, something we've called the three C's. And it was funny. That came because we were talking before we started the podcast. I was just jotting down notes. What are we going to talk about? What are we going to talk about? And almost everything I had started with a C. And because I'm emotionally immature, I decided to go out and start calling it the three C's.
That's not emotional immaturity. That's long newspaper training. We like alliteration in newspaper land, all right?
I'm not convinced there's much daylight between long newspaper training and emotional immaturity.
But have to recruit somehow.
Yeah, I guess. So look, the Prime Minister, we had a chance last week to talk about this because when we recorded our podcast last week, and we're recording this early on Friday, every time we record early, I get nervous because God only knows what the hell is going to happen. But we're recording it. We had just caught the fact that the Liberals had backed away from the carbon tax. And I put this in the description of the episode to make it clear. When we recorded it last week, it wasn't entirely clear yet what all the details were. And I want to just be very clear about this. If you use home heating oil and you are anywhere in the country that is backstopped by the federal program, you will get the carbon tax removed by it. It is not limited to Atlantic Canada. But in a practical sense, overwhelmingly, heating oil is used as a share of fuel in Atlantic Canada. One of the things I thought was interesting this week is that you've seen a lot of smart people. Trevor Tombe has been saying it. A bunch of columnists have been saying it. Editorial boards have been saying it. This has functionally killed the carbon tax, but the Liberals are not backing off on this yet. A series of ministers, and then the Prime Minister himself, has made a point of going, no more carve-outs. We are sticking to it on the carbon tax. Jen, you can advance. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Not only is that unsustainable from just a thoughtful, intelligent point of view, it's unsustainable from a regional divide point of view, which is why we're now starting to see a couple of things. One, the political implications of this particular fallback position is that Trudeau is in deep, deep shit. He clearly had to make a very embarrassing concession on a central policy in order to prevent some kind of serious internal caucus division. We're now seeing more evidence of that begin to emerge. And usually when you start to see evidence of major internal caucus division, it never really stops at one thing. So this week, a PEI Senator, Percy Downe, has written an op-ed basically saying, love you, Justin.
Bye.
It's time to go. It's time for you to leave. Now, Percy Downe was a long-time Liberal stalwart. He was very gentle in his approach, but it's also pretty clear that he's not just speaking on his own behalf. He's feels empowered to speak because there's a lot of internal Liberal caucus discussion about the fact that Trudeau really is not going to be he's not going to be the guy who ought to be leading the party into the next election. So usually when you start to see signals like that, you pay attention to them as journalists because these signals they're never singular, right? It's usually the beginning of a campaign, or once once cracks in the facade begin to show, those cracks continue to spread. It's like a chip on your windshield. You know what I mean? Like you can handle a couple of chips on your windshield, but before you notice, no, you're going to get a crack in your windshield.
I remember driving on the highway once, a freeway going towards Detroit, I think, from Toronto. I don't remember, going to see maybe a Red Wings game or something. And I'm looking with growing unease at the crack on my windshield that's getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And it started with a little chip off of a truck. And by the time I made it to Michigan, it was like my windshield was shot.
Trudeau is literally driving
to Detroit. Yeah.
He's driving to Detroit in the middle of winter with like about 20 or 30 little pebbled cracks in his windshield or chips in his windshield, and he ain't going to make it. He ain't going to make it to the end. So
the Percy Downe op-ed was interesting too, because it would be one thing if it was hearing kind of the legions of unnamed source close to the PMO, like the Ottawa is just chock-a-block with those. If they were going, the polls suck and the carbon tax move sucks and the PMO is old and stale, that would be fine. But what Percy Downe wrote in his op-ed, and apparently it was first in the Hill Times and then it got picked up by National Newswatch, he didn't just politely say it was time for Trudeau to go. He said it was time for the Liberal Party to move back to the fiscally responsible center.
That's right. He said they need to move back to the center left.
So, like, if it was just, look, senators go rogue sometimes. Like, what, are they going to lose their jobs? Like, senators can say whatever the hell they want. But when you have a very politely written op-ed that is not just mentioning, oh, the polls are bad, but saying the polls are bad and here's what the party needs to do, that to me, look, it could still be a senator going rogue. I get it. But that reads to me more like an opening move of factions within liberaldom going, we've had enough.
Well, I know that, but the fact that he's from PEI also indicates that there's something happening specifically within the Atlantic caucus, which also ties back to the carbon tax as well. I think the Atlantic Liberal caucus comes from very much a red Tory school.
Yeah.
You know, this is not urban Toronto woke left shit coming from the Atlantic Canada.
The Atlantic Canadians are the last sane Canadians.
Yeah, exactly. And will be to the very end. Back when you and I are ravering, gibbering idiots and have gone way off the camp, trust me, it'll be the Atlantic Canadians who'll be the last stalwarts of the nation. But yeah, they're pretty grounded, they're pretty centered. They don't have, they're not downtown Toronto people, they're not Alberta people, they're not, they're their own thing. And it's very interesting to me that you're seeing an obvious fracture within the Liberal caucus come from the red Tories, very centrist, I tend to think that most Atlantic Canadian Liberals and us wouldn't actually be very far apart on most issues. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, look, you put me in a bar with an Atlantic Liberal and an Atlantic Conservative, and we pound a couple of pints. After a couple of hours, I still might not know which one's which.
Yeah, there you go. So then the other thing that
you know what? Can I add this?
Sure, yeah, go.
This is not even. See, we're talking about Senator Downe. We're talking about the carbon tax being aimed a lot at benefiting Atlantic Canadians. But we just need to rewind a couple of months when you and I started to notice the pendulum swinging big on the trans issues. It wasn't when Doug Ford and Danielle Smith's governments were touching this. It was when the Atlantic Canadian Conservatives started to pick it up.
Yeah, that's actually a good point as well.
So a lot of the big stories in Canadian politics right now are bubbling up out of Atlantic Canada.
Mm-hmm.
I love Atlantic Canada. I can't wait to go back. It's one of my favorite parts of the country.
I'd like to retire in Atlantic Canada, actually.
It is beautiful.
Wouldn't that be great?
The food is amazing. The people are great.
It's amazing. People are great. I could have like a little house on the ocean. It'd be amazing.
Yeah, anyway, I'm sure they'll welcome you with open arms like a liberator. But I will say, I say this with
another 10 years of Liberal government. They probably
will. They might. I don't want my Atlantic Canadian listeners right now, our Atlantic Canadian listeners, to feel slighted by this. Atlantic Canada does not normally drive the national conversation. The last 3 or 4 months, it has been. That's interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. So anyway, an interesting thing to note. The other thing that as a result of the carbon tax, now we're seeing the beginning of a nascent carbon tax revolt. Scott Moe has announced
Doug Ford,
yeah, we are not going to be remitting carbon tax on heating fuel from our utilities. Again, I think we're going to see a similar move from an Atlantic Canadian province as well. So that'll be interesting to watch. So it's interesting to me that the Atlantic Canadian provinces on a lot of different files are starting to align themselves with almost the prairie conservative style stuff, which is, wow, that's a shift, right? So carbon tax fallout is continuing. I think that the fallout is going to continue for many more weeks to come. It's going to damage the federal government for many more weeks to come. On top of that, we had a return cameo from a long lost and seasoned Canadian figure. Matt, would you like to go into the trials and tribulations of Mark Carney?
I mean, no.
You have no choice. No, you speak for a nation. You speak for a nation by saying no, and yet here we are, forced yet again to have a conversation about Matt Carney. So, Mark Carney.
Like the seasoned broadcaster I am, the moment you turn the podcast over to me, I choke on my carbonated drink.
Yeah, that's why I was trying to talk over you. So I was doing you a favor there.
Thanks.
Anyway, so Carney gave an exclusive interview to, I believe, Marieke Walsh at the Globe and Mail, where he would not rule out another run for leadership. Has he
run or a first run
before? A first run. He's floated this idea before and then kind of backed out. And in the process of floating this idea yet again, he made one of the most politically asinine statements I think that I've heard in a long while. He basically tried to take pot shots at Pierre Poilievre, saying, I mean, I'm paraphrasing here, sometimes these career politicians who have no idea how the world works outside of their space, have no idea how decisions get made, unlike me, former Bank of Canada governor Mark Carney, who does understand these things, unlike you lowly plebeians. I mean, I'm inserting my own villainous accent there.
Yeah, to say a very nebulous accent.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot of room within the concept of paraphrasing, and I'm running with it.
Next thing you know, it's a totally new fictional language. It's like Jen quotes Mark Carney in Klingon.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry, if I'm speaking too fast, I apologize to our readers. I'm drinking some very caffeinated tea, so I maybe should slow it down. I apologize.
Mark Carney. I mean, if you thought Michael Ignatieff was great, I think there was a piece we ran in the line a couple of months ago, and it was by Mitch Heimpel. And Mitch wrote it, and I've been thinking about this piece actually a lot over the last week. Actually, let me reset this just a tiny bit, because I actually want to link the carbon tax directly to this, but it's all part of the same narrative here.
Go for it.
What Mitch had written about months ago for us was that in the first decade of this century, there was what we could call the Obama school of politicians. Hope and change. Yes, we can. No to the Iraq war, no to the financial crisis, no to neoconservatism. And he had a series of leaders elected in the West. Obama, obviously the first. Well, maybe actually Tony Blair the first. I come to think of it. I'd have to go back and think about it. But you had this era of sort of business-friendly progressives, not like old school late 20th century socialists, but like
I wouldn't even call them progressive. I would just call them business-friendly liberals.
Yeah, okay,
of
sure.
Small L school,
Yeah, or maybe gently progressive, right? Like we're gonna push on some social issues. And then what Mitch had suggested was that these guys had a great run for a while. You had a bunch of them elected: Blair, Obama, Ardern in New Zealand, Macron in France.
Trudeau tried to characterize himself as this as well.
Exactly. Merkel in Germany, and very much Justin Trudeau in Canada. But what Mitch had suggested, and is that history is pivoted, that era has ended, and it hasn't ended simultaneously in all places because different countries are on their own trajectories and stuff. But we are now moving out of that era, and we're looking at an era where you've got Donald Trump, or like maybe we can find less insane versions of that, but where the whole Obama style of politics had a window in time, but it's fucking over. And what Mitch,
boy, is it?
Yeah, no, for sure. And what Mitch had suggested was that because of our own fluky domestic political realities, Justin Trudeau might be the last survivor of that order. And I guess it would be a toss-up between him and Macron, but even Macron has pivoted to he ain't what he was when he was first elected. And the reason I bring this up, and the reason I wanted to set this back to the carbon tax, and before we get to Carney, is that one of the last policies I ever would have imagined Justin Trudeau circa 2015 abandoning would have been the carbon tax. And he will say, and liberals will say, that they haven't abandoned it. No, and that's true, they haven't. But
they've just fatally poisoned it. It's different.
They're in the worst possible position now, because there are times, and you and I were grown-ups, there are times when politicians have to advocate for stupid policy because it's great politics. And there's even times when politicians have the courage to advocate for good policy, even when it's bad politics. But what Justin Trudeau has established here is a bad political case to defend a bad policy. He has no winning scenario here. And I've been thinking about what Mitch had written as sort of like the walls of reality are closing in around the Macron or Obama, Merkel era leaders here.
The Hopi changey
leaders, Sunny Ways.
It's the, what do you call it? Cohort. There we go. Hopi changey cohort.
And Trudeau is a very good politician. And everybody always thinks I'm being shitty when I say that about him. Like, no, I mean that very sincerely. He is a really good politician. But you and I have been saying for almost a year and a half now, he's not anymore. He was. And people keep talking about he's a fearsome campaigner. He's great at fundraising. Yep. Okay, fine. Granted. But he's like, some of what his government has been doing recently, you cannot look at that and go, they're playing four-dimensional chess here. It's just dumb.
Yeah.
And when we talk about Mark Carney, and this is kind of why I wanted to go back and set it up with Trudeau and the carbon tax, Mark Carney is the natural Justin Trudeau successor if you were running down a list.
Of the Hopi Changey era.
Yeah. He's the guy who you'd be like, in the Hopi Changey era, when it was sunny ways and Trudeau had a big majority and he was legalizing dope and doing all of his big policy successes were in his majority term, right? Mark Carney was the guy that liberals would look at and they'd go, you know what? One day he's next. Justin's going to come in and he's going to tax carbon and he's going to legalize dope and he's going to rationalize the childcare benefits. But one day Mark Carney will take over and he's going to take it the next 10 yards down the field. Mark Carney might have been good in 2015. I have no faith in his ability to do it in 2023. And I have less faith in the ability of the remaining liberals around Justin Trudeau to understand why that is so.
Okay, so here's the other point that I would make about all of this, and it goes back to your meta-narrative.
Of which one?
Why did the Hopi Changey era end?
Because our expectations were the problem.
Well, that's part of it. But part of it also was, bluntly, I think that if you look back at the last 6 to 8 years, maybe 10, you are going to be able to identify key policy areas where the trusted institutions and experts of the country on everything from inflationary policy to certain aspects of COVID policy to expectations around journalistic norms to academic norms. I mean, run through the list and you are going to find many, many examples where the expert and institutional, the technocratic class of this country and many other Western countries has shat the bed. And the fact that the expert class, I'm gonna generalize grossly here. The fact that this class of people does not seem to understand that it has lost the fundamental trust of the people who it governs, and that it has even shat the bed in so many different files as a result, leading to the current state of fundamental distrust, collapse in media, cost of living crises, et cetera, means that would you have a hidebound technocrat like Carney come into the picture and basically say, you plebeians don't know any better, you don't actually understand how any of this works or how decisions get made? The stock response of the people whom he would seek to govern with that kind of message is, fuck you and the horse you rode in on. You didn't understand the systems that you were messing with, and now I can't afford my home heating bill, and my kids can't afford a house. So, like, he's almost perfectly emblematic of the rejection of that class of politician and leader. And I think that if you were to stack him up against Pierre Poilievre, it would be the largest single wipeout in Canadian history for any conservative leader going back to the founding of the country.
I think, yes. It's funny how even when you were talking about what the reaction is, and podcast listeners will never have the privilege of knowing what our YouTube watchers will know, which is that when Jen was describing what the reaction to Mark Carney trying to explain to Canadians why they don't understand that their home heating bills going up is a good thing, I was very slowly raising my middle finger into the frame of the camera.
We don't confine our potty mouths here. We have visual. We swear visually and verbally.
You know what? And the thing is too, like I have actually a lot of admiration for technocrats, and I think I understand why technocrats are important, because you can't have morons running around.
Oh, you need technocrats to actually run the practical stuff, but technocrats aren't the ones in charge. Technocrats are not the leaders. We're a democratic nation.
I think
and the
what
technocrats need to understand their place in the hierarchy, and it's not number one.
I don't know if I have a concise way to describe this. Like I'm a writer and a broadcaster. I should be able to come up with a snappy little description of this, but it seems to me that one of the big problems we have in this country is that our governing elites, and that includes the technocrats, but also the politicians and all the people generally in that orbit, have come to a gentleman's agreement that accountability doesn't apply. Mm-hmm. That we're like accountability sucks. It's unpleasant. It's awkward. It's uncomfortable. We're just going to sand all those edges off. And I believe in technocracy. I really do believe in that. We need experts in positions of authority and influence, but there also has to be an effective accountability mechanisms.
That's right.
That when a technocrat or the technocrats broadly fuck up, they get fired.
And to do that, you need to have an effective democratic accountability process. You have to make sure that the technocrats understand that they are accountable to and serve at the pleasure of elected officials. The elected officials hold the power over the technocrat to fire them at will, essentially, or within reasonable hiring and firing procedures. And the politicians themselves are then accountable for their hiring and firing decisions at the whim of the will of the people. That's how the snake eats its tail in a democracy, and it's messy and it's inefficient, but that's what we got.
And there's all these different checks and balances in a healthy democracy where the civil service tells the government what is possible, but the government will kick the civil service's ass when they're not executing properly. Absolutely. The media holds the government to account. Mm-hmm. The technocrats call the media out when we're talking bullshit because we don't know what we're talking about. Like there's all these different ways in a healthy ecosystem where we hold each other to account. None of them are working right now.
No.
None of them are working. So a guy like Mark Carney, I'd probably like him. I'd love to talk to him. I'd love to pick his brain. I think he would have so many interesting things to say.
We'd have a very happy Q&A with him at the line.
100%. And I would enjoy it.
But he lacks the political, like many classical liberals of that party, right now, he lacks the political know to understand the sphere in which he's operating in, the mood of the room, essentially, and he lacks the self-awareness to understand how he is at odds with that mood.
You know what? I mean, actually, I think that's right, but I'm actually going to say one word in his possible defense here. It's actually possible he understands all of those things, but that he does not have the lifetime of the necessary skill set to do anything about it. Because you might understand that you're in a bar fight, but if you've never thrown a punch in your life, you're going to lose that bar fight. And it might not be a failure to understand. It might just be going, I'm in a situation and I have total clarity of what situation I'm in. And I don't have the first friggin' clue what I'm supposed to do with it right now. And I think Pierre Poilievre, who's a seasoned political brawler, versus Mark Carney,
wipes the floor with him. I mean, and this flips Mark Carney's own comment back on his head.
Oh, complete.
He criticizes Pierre Poilievre for being a career politician who doesn't understand how decisions get made in places like the Bank of Canada.
Step into Poilievre's world, Mark.
Yes, step into Poilievre's world. But you have no understanding of the political world that you're seeking to enter or considering entering, and no actual natural talent or instinct for it at all. So anyway, that's sort of where I would leave off Carney. I do want to talk very briefly about costumes, and then before we transition to the next thing.
It's the third C.
That's the third C.
He said Trudeau's getting killed here this week by 3 C's. Carbon tax. Carney, he's not getting killed by Carney, but there's obviously the leadership speculation starting. So, okay. Plus the third C, God help us, costumes.
Costumes. Yes, once again, we as a nation sigh a collective groan as we contemplate yet again some poor costume choices made by someone with the last name Trudeau. So I don't want to belabor this particular point because effectively what happened is that one of Trudeau's kids did a really, a perfectly fine Halloween costume where he was like, was that the girl?
I think it was Hadrian, but I'm not sure.
Anyway, the kid was like beheaded, and then they ran the costume above the head, so it looked like they were holding their own head. Essentially. It's a very classic Halloween costume.
I'm sure the poor kid.
I'm sure the poor kid put a lot of effort into it. No, absolutely. And also this poor child, I'm sure, has not been up on the daily headlines about the atrocities from Hamas and Israel, okay? So I'm sure that the kid was completely innocent of any kind of broader geopolitical implications or remembrances brought about by a costume of that nature. The kid should have been able to use that costume, wear that costume in public. I have no problem with it.
It was a kick-ass costume. It was a really good.
It was a kick-ass costume. But the leader of a G7 nation with a presumably intact PR team should have been able to look at pictures of that costume with the prime minister and say, maybe we shouldn't be tweeting this one out in the current moment. And I think that there was some poor judgment exercised by either the prime minister directly or by mostly his PR team, who really should have said, when we're dealing with actual news stories of children being beheaded in Israel, maybe we shouldn't be tweeting this one out. We don't have to tweet out everything. That's not something we can just not tweet this one out. We can just not tweet this one out and it will be fine. But they did. And I think that was just, as I said, am I outraged? No. But do I think that it was a PR mistake? Yeah. And I think that it just was an error in judgment. And, on top of a week of Trudeau being in trouble, it certainly is not helping. It's not helping him. It's not helping him. Let's just put it that way.
I think that's bang on. An editor at a paper this week asked me if I had anything to say about it, and I said honestly, what I would have to say about it is I have no objection to the costume. The last thing I want to do is drag the prime minister's kid into this, and I think innocent. I think in when the world's on fire, I don't think we should be wasting a lot of ink on costumes. But I said the only insight that I think is actually worth commenting on is what you and I were saying a few minutes ago. They used to be good at politics and they aren't anymore, because there should have been someone in the prime minister's loop who goes, what, that's a great costume, but the picture might land wrong right now.
Yeah. Yep.
And in a healthy ecosystem of any kind, there's someone in your loop who says that. And I want to give you an example. I think I've mentioned this example before. I had a very kindly editor say to me once, because I had a column, I used the metaphor crashed and burned. And this was shortly after Jim Prentice had died. And I had an editor say to me, you're not writing about Alberta politics, but the National Post is well read in Alberta. This has just happened. Let's just use a different metaphor there. And I went, yeah, thank you. Thank you for being the person in my loop who because obviously I didn't intend anything. It was just, they're crashing. Exactly. The scandal continues as the poll ratings crash and burn and blah, blah, blah. And I just had an editor go, yeah, you know what? Given the context of right now, this completely innocent usage of a fairly benign term would land badly among a segment of the population that would otherwise probably enjoy and agree with the piece.
Yeah.
Let's just replace it with anything else. So
anything else.
I think I said something like continues to struggle. And I was grateful to the editor who didn't change any other word of the column, because no one likes getting their copy fuddled with. But basically it was, this particular phrase will land wrong right now. Let's change it. That's all the prime minister needed. He just needed someone to go, man, that is a kick-ass costume. He's going to clean up at trick-or-treating. But given the sensitivities of right now, this could land wrong if we tweet it.
Yep. Exactly. And also the rules are a little bit different when you're the prime minister of a major country as opposed to just some ordinary dad going trick-or-treating. Just what it is. So anyway, I don't want to, like I said, I don't want to belabor the point. I just think it's the third C in our nice little alliterative trio, and we all know how much journalists like alliterations and triptychs. You know what I mean? So we're going to go with there. I really want to let it go. Do you want to talk about the Middle East next? Or firstly, and subscribe the line. Like and subscribe the line.
Like and subscribe, yeah.
Have you liked and subscribed the line? You should like and subscribe the line before we transition to this next topic.
Like and subscribe, share with everybody you know, help us beat those algorithms. You know what? My sense, why don't we actually close the loop on domestic stuff? Why don't we spend a couple of minutes? I don't think we need much more than that. Our fourth C, but unrelated to the first three C's.
And we don't like to break up the trios. Trios are a nice little elegant
we're gonna leave
thing.
The trio alone.
Yeah.
CBC. Catherine
CBC.
Tate. Catherine, I
Catherine
guess, technically could be a fifth C.
CBC, yeah.
Okay, hang on, let's see if I can stretch this out. CBC Commander Catherine chatting contentiously. I can't think of confronts
before
comments.
committee before commits committee.
But see, before is a B. So I said CBC's Catherine confronts Commons Committee. There we go.
There you go. That's
Nailed
the
it.
one.
Yeah.
Loved it.
Subscribe now.
That's how you know you're dealing with a professional newspaper. Right there.
All right. So you actually watched this more than I did. I came up with the C's, but you tell me what actually happened.
So I don't want to reiterate points that we've already made in previous weeks. Like,
oh my God, I'm sorry to interrupt. You know
what?
Country club cage fight.
Country club cage fight in front of Commons Committee. Catherine Tate's country club cage fight at Commons Committee. That's good. We're putting that in the description box. Might make that our title. Okay, so Catherine Tate is the president of the CBC, and she, I think, I can't speak to her managerial skills in terms of managing the CBC. Maybe she's great, maybe she's not. I don't care. Her political sense is about as on point as Carney's, as far as I can tell. So she was brought before Parliament to testify to, I believe it was the Heritage Committee. I'll check that, to discuss CBC's policy on the use of the word terrorist and terrorism, and also to account for the mistake that the CBC initially made, like many other major media outlets, after the bombing in Hamas a couple of weeks ago that turned out was really just a misdirected Hamas rocket. So I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of this, because in principle, Tate is entirely correct, and her testimony was also entirely correct. Parliament shouldn't be bringing up any person within the CBC to task for ostensibly independent journalistic decisions. You and I have talked about the CBC's decision to not use the word terrorism in the past. We both think it's perfectly intellectually defensible. Other totally credible media outlets also have made the same kind of decision. They don't declare something a terrorist unless it's been attributed. So somebody else can say someone is a terrorist, but they are not going to say in their own straight reporting that someone's a terrorist. That is an intellectually
cognitively consistent.
It's cognitively consistent. Has the CBC itself been perfectly consistent in the use of its style guide? No, but then you know what? Nobody is ever perfectly consistent in the use of their own style guide, so that's fair. We personally would disagree with that decision. We don't. We think it's a bit of a cop-out, and we think it's perfectly fine for news outlets to use the word terrorism and terrorist, just so long as it's being used appropriately and correctly. However, other media organizations have different style guides, and they've got their style guides align with their respective values, and that's perfectly fine.
Yep.
So for the CBC So for the CBC to be called out in a parliamentary committee to discuss this stuff is inappropriate. It's like, sorry, the CBC ought to be journalistically independent of Parliament, and Parliament shouldn't be able to compel anybody to account for their own internal journalistic standards and practices. Totally agree with that in principle. In reality, in the real political world in which we live, people can be compelled to testify in front of Parliament. CBC is enormously, if not almost totally dependent, not totally, but almost totally dependent on government funding. And I believe Tate herself owes her job to the fact that she was, if not appointed directly, then appointed at the pleasure of the Prime Minister's office. I think it's technically the Governor General who appoints her, but like the Prime Minister's office chooses her. So to say that this organization is independent of government interference in the same way that, say, Global or CTV isn't quite correct either. And the problem is that, of course, we're going to be going into a news cycle when the Conservative Party of Canada has openly declared that they're going to be defunding this organization. And as a result, what I think the CBC still doesn't quite get is that it's in a cage fight for its life. And Catherine Tate can go in there and go testify before Parliament and offer these prim and proper country club style notes about how this is inappropriate. And what 99% of people are going to see is the clip that got put on Rachel Thomas and MP Rachel Thomas, and MP Melissa Lantsman's Twitter page, which shows her refusing to apologize for getting the hospital bombing story wrong. Right? And most people aren't going to be able to, or aren't going to choose to, say, hey, is it appropriate for her to be even testifying about this at all? Like, nobody cares. All they're going to see is Catherine Tate saying, I won't apologize and I won't retract for screwing up a story on Hamas and Israel. That's all they're going to see.
Ms. Lantzman.
You mentioned in your opening comments that public trust was the most important. So I want to speak to this motion. On October 17th, the CBC published a false headline based on dangerous disinformation that incorrectly stated that Israel was responsible for the explosion at the hospital in Gaza that resulted in the deaths of innocent civilians. And if you don't have it, I have it right here. That is the headline. It says, hundreds killed in Israeli airstrike on Gaza City Hospital, Palestinian Health Ministry in Gaza says. And that was since changed, if you don't have this, to Palestinians say hundreds killed in Israeli airstrike on hospital. Israel blames Islamic Jihad. This still lives on the CBC website. So this headline, it's still there. It remains on the website. And I would hope that you would agree with me that, in fact, the Palestinian Health Authority is controlled by Hamas. I think that is a fact. The Prime Minister, the Minister of National Defense, the United States, the British and French governments all have definitively said that the attack did not come from Israel. So why won't the CBC?
If I may bring the members' attention to the facts and correct the record. CBC first reported on the terrifically horrific attack or a bomb in the hospital in the Gaza Strip based on an Associated Press report that is a trusted source of news for us. You'll notice if you go to cbc.ca or radiocanada.ca, we often use news feeds from other trusted, reputable news organizations. And we sourced and we cited the source of that information, as Madam Lantzman has just pointed out. 90 minutes later, when we received the corrected information, we also updated the site. I just would like to say, we stand behind our journalism. In conflicts and in war, news comes at a very fast rate, and people are claiming on both sides of the story. Our journalists on the ground and in our newsrooms are obliged to measure and take account.
I appreciate that's an Associated Press article, and your mandate is to, you are responsible to Canadians. It's $1.4 billion of taxpayer money. But you said that that you stand by the statement. Palestinians say hundreds killed in Israeli airstrike on Israel Hospital. Israel blames Islamic Jihad. That still exists. It is a headline that has been debunked by governments across the world, including even our own Prime Minister, albeit 7 days late. So I want to know if you'll apologize to Jewish Canadians. I want to know if you'll apologize to Canadians. And I want to know when we can expect a retraction from CBC.
Mr. President, I will, Mr. Chair, Monsieur le Président, I will not apologize because the journalism is among the finest in the world. Our journalists operate in an independent fashion, independent of management, independent of the board of directors, and independent of government and political influence. They are guided by the journalistic standards and practices, and I invite any member and any Canadian to refer to these practices on our website. They are transparent and they are public, and if you have a concern, anyone has a concern with our journalism, I invite you to address it to the independent ombudsman en français ou en anglais in order to have them independently investigate and review the application of our journalism.
I understand that you're not going to apologize for printing disinformation, but how can the CBC, who's committed to truth, who's committed to standards, not call Hamas terrorists? We saw a leaked memo from the Director of Journalistic Standards, that's Mr. Achi, who sent a directive to journalists for saying not using to not use or describe Hamas as a terrorist group. You do agree, it is fact that that Hamas has been listed as a terrorist organization in 2002 in this country, correct?
I will address the issue as follows, Mr. Chair. And I think there's a fantastic blog by our head of news, Brodie Fenlon, which you can refer to. He does this very often to comment on making journalism transparent, explaining to Canadians how we do the journalism. And in the case of attribution, this is a policy that we have had at CBC Radio-Canada for over several decades. It is shared and mirrored by many other reputable news organizations, including the Globe and Mail, the BBC, Agence France Presse, Reuters, and any number of other agencies. So I would just say the attribution, we use the word terrorist and terrorism and acknowledge that Canada, the UK, and the US consider Hamas a terrorist organization, but we, as journalists, do not make that attribution.
Merci, Madame Landsman. Madame Landsman, merci. Votre temps est écoulé. Vous aurez l'occasion de vous reprendre un prochain.
Thank you. Your time is up, Ms. Landsman.
Again, we keep on making this point, but CBC, Rachel Thomas and Michelle Landsman may be technically wrong, but they're cage fighters. They don't care. They're coming for you. They're coming for you hard, and you don't know how to play this game with them, and you're losing, even though you're right. And that's what I think is disturbing for me.
Completely concur comprehensively.
Okay. There we go. I like it when we completely concur comprehensively. It's so much nicer.
Almost everything I said to you in that last segment started with C. I think that, well, look, this loops us back to what we were talking about Mark Carney. Sometimes you're in a bar fight, but you don't know how to handle yourself in a bar fight. Most of us wouldn't.
Yep. Yeah.
And I think Country Club is probably, 2 more C's, but it's also, I don't think you're wrong. I mean, I think there has been in this country a style of doing things that has held sway. You call it Laurentian or Canadian consensus, 2 more C's if you want, but I think yeah. And I don't think that works anymore. Or at least
congenial.
The Conservatives
are
C-word. Congenial, yeah. The Conservatives are at the very least more combative, another C word. And they are the politics of confrontation, another one, is something that we have talked about before as being not accidental. It is completely coherent. I can't think of another C word, but it's deliberate. It is a chosen strategy, and I think they are counting on the fact that people are not going to be able to adapt. And Catherine Tate
is demonstrating that they are correct,
at least thus far. I mean, better is always possible, but I'm not seeing any sign that the CBC knows how to handle themselves in this kind of a fight. And I'm not seeing any sign that Mark Carney would do any better. I don't like the fact that the Conservatives are doing this. I liked the polite consensus. I really preferred that. It's makes our jobs easier, but I think it's over. And you and I will adapt. We'll see if the CBC can.
On that note, shameless transition, like and subscribe The Line. Yes, we are going to be obnoxious about this. In fact, I could think of another C word to describe the way we're going to be about making these things, but I can't say that on air because that would probably be too far. But do like and subscribe The Line. Last topic, Matt.
First of all, just apologies to the listeners and the viewers. I don't know. I'm drinking my drink on the air, and I think I somehow aspirated like half a liter of bubbly here, so I've been struggling all episode by voice.
I just tucked over you and made another C joke, but
no, I heard it, but I was also couldn't breathe.
Yeah, that's fine. Anyway,
I know, I know the C word, Jen. The situation in Gaza is obviously a nightmare, and I know that sounds very trite saying this. There is continuing footage coming out of Gaza, which is horrifying, of civilians caught up in these attacks. Israel controversially hit a refugee camp in Gaza. Gaza itself is essentially a refugee camp at this point. But yeah, Israel said that they were going for a military target, and there have been claimed hundreds of casualties. We can't confirm that, but you know what? I don't know the exact details of this. And I think you and I talked last week about this. Even if you support Israel's right to self-defense, there's going to be gray zones. There's going to be gray zones where even people like you and I, who are very much pro Israel's right to self-defense, are going to be running up against the reality that there's no clean way to fight an urban war. And I don't know enough about the specific bombing of this target to say whether or not it was militarily proportional, whether or not the civilian losses were offset by the military advantage gained. But what I will say is that this is going to continue. I have, in a perverse way this week, felt better about the situation for a couple of reasons. I think people need to know what I mean by better. It's still fucking awful, and it's going to be worse before it's over. But there have been a couple of encouraging signs this week. First of all, on Friday, the Hezbollah leadership, Hassan Nasrallah, gave a speech that he'd been building up to for a couple of days. And the speech is a nothing burger. You know, Hezbollah has effectively opted out. They have basically said, you know, Jews, death to the Jews are bad, Israel blamed for everything, and Hamas, good luck. They're not getting into this. So I think what we're going to continue to see for now, and God knows we can see deterioration, but the signal from Nasrallah was we were not consulted and we were not involved. Iran was not involved. And we're going to continue skirmishing on our border with Israel. We're going to continue shelling military bases, and we'll lob the odd rocket, but we're not going to start a war. So that, to me, we'll see if it holds. But that's an encouraging sign. One of the nightmare scenarios that I've been looking at is that Hezbollah jumping in could be what tipped this thing over into a regional conflict. It could still happen, but I am...
Isn't the involvement of Yemen in all of this a little bit concerning? A counterpoint to your optimism?
It is concerning, but if I had to pick whether I'd want the Houthis shelling me or Hezbollah, I would take the Houthis 99 times out of 100.
Yeah, fair.
They're less powerful, and they're further away. They don't pose as much of an escalation risk as Hezbollah. Now, does Hezbollah honor its word, or does it feel compelled by later events to change its mind? We'll see. But for now, I'm encouraged. The other thing I'm encouraged about, and again, this is very mild encouragement, it seems to me that some of the wildly raucous protests we'd been seeing, at least in North America, have chilled out a bit. And I heard a really interesting way of describing it in some of the news coverage here, which is that they're not getting smaller, and they're not getting less outrageous in some of the rhetoric that's being used, but they seem to be getting more professionalized, where it's not so much really angry people. It's becoming a little bit more of the, we got our flags and our slogans and we're marching, meet at the legislature at noon and we'll march on City Hall. I don't mind people saying appalling things in a democracy as long as it's calm. So I don't want to declare victory on this one. So no one do the George W. Bush mission accomplished banner gif here, because believe me, I'm still worried about this. But I hope that things are settling down a little bit on that front, and that we might all have to confront really unpleasant stuff. You and I were talking before we started the podcast. You and I have both had conversations with friends in the last 24 hours where the friends have turned to us for comfort because they've discovered somebody in their life is a friggin' anti-Semite.
And in some cases, the person whom they're talking about this to us about aren't even necessarily self-aware of their anti-Semitism. You know, like I've had a lot of people saying things to me on Twitter saying, criticizing Israel is not anti-Semitism. And my response is, yeah, absolutely correct. Criticizing Israel is not anti-Semitism. Israel is a nation state, and it deserves criticism like any other nation state does.
Yep.
I'm sure it's just a coincidence that you developed this very rational and measured criticism of Netanyahu 30 seconds after Hamas went on a full-on anti-Jewish rape and baby beheading murdering spree. I'm sure that's just a coincidence.
It's funny how that keeps happening.
Right? Like,
Yeah, look, what I always say when someone says to me, criticism of Israel is not necessarily anti-Semitic, I agree 100%, because I'm critical of Israel in some files. Their policies, particularly towards the West Bank right now, are appalling, and I think they're actually going to harm Israel's war efforts. And I think the Israelis should get their shit together over there before some Palestinian with a GoPro records some Israeli soldier doing something that knocks Israel's public support in the Western world down by 30 points. It'd be nice to do it for moral reasons, but I hope self-interest might suffice. But I think when someone tells me that criticism of Israel is not always anti-Semitic, I reply, absolutely, but criticism of Israel sometimes is anti-Semitic. Yeah. And the question for everybody is, what side of that line are you on? Because it ain't always the side of the line you think you're on.
Well, and I don't think I don't think a lot of the people who are saying stuff like that, or who are saying things like, we talked about last week, from the river to the sea, I don't think they're thinking that's an anti-Semitic position because they're not thinking through the implications of what they're arguing for, right? How exactly does Palestine get free from the river to the sea? Please explain that to me.
No.
Oh,
no,
well,
I'd prefer not to.
I'd prefer not to. Which part of Palestine needs to be freed?
Well, the part from the river to the sea.
Part from the river to the sea.
All of it?
Where did the Jews go in this version of Palestine you'd like to see
further
free?
questions.
There'll be Palestinian Jews. And I'm sure Palestinian Jews and a Hamas-run Palestinian state are going to do very well. How do you think that ends exactly? They're not thinking through the implications of these positions, right? And so, no, I don't think they're being consciously anti-Semitic most of the time. Some of them are definitely being consciously anti-Semitic. I don't think a lot of it is conscious anti-Semitism. It's just, if you take their own logic at face value, it inevitably leads you to a position where Israel has an obligation to be pacifist in the face of actual genocidal people in their midst. And Israel doesn't actually have a legitimate moral right to defend itself because they don't believe that Israel has an actual legitimate right to exist. It's a white settler colony of oppression.
It's what you and I talk about a lot of the time, right? Like a theoretical right to defend yourself, so long as you don't actually do it with military force.
Yeah, as long as you don't kill a single Palestinian civilian.
It's not. Cool. It's just not realistic.
Cool.
Which doesn't mean, again, like I can understand. I don't know enough about the refugee camp strike to comment on it authoritatively, but I can tell you that this is exactly the kind of situation Israel is potentially going to get itself in trouble over, because I think what's very frustrating here is people have a very superficial knowledge of what the laws of war are. Mm-hmm. And even if you have expert knowledge, ask any trial lawyer, you'll have experts both sides who look at the same thing and draw a different conclusion.
Absolutely.
Israel's experts within their own armed forces, the guys who have to sign off on the legality of every strike, they are motivated to sign off.
And not only that, but I think neither you nor I has been naive about mistakes and overreaches that the IDF has made in the past.
95% accuracy in your weapons. When you're throwing tens of thousands of them around, you're going to have thousands of misses.
Yeah, exactly. And then there have also been terrible examples where the IDF has done some really, really brutal and horrible things to Palestinians, and has been bullshit about it. So, neither Matt and I nor naive about those facts. We're not.
The only thing I remember at a debate once, someone said to me, "You seem to think Israel is perfect." I said, "No, Israel is not perfect." I said, "Israel does not need to be perfect to be right," and that did not go over well.
But apparently, I think it does, right?
You want to talk about the specific word genocide?
I just think that we're throwing around the word genocide too cavalierly in the West once again.
So it's a habit we have, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a habit we have. So there was a longtime UN official who very publicly resigned over what's now happening in Gaza, and is now calling what's happening in Gaza a quote-unquote genocide. And to me, that's not what genocide means. Genocide doesn't mean killing people. Genocide doesn't mean killing lots of people. Genocide means killing lots of people with the explicit intent to eliminate them as a people. Okay, it isn't just you killed lots of people in Gaza. That's a genocide. Genocide has another connotation to it, and it's important to remember that Hamas is a explicitly genocidal organization that lacks the capacity to carry through on that genocidal intent. Okay, Israel, ironically, has the capacity to commit genocide, but lacks the intent to commit genocide in Gaza.
The desire.
Bluntly, if Israel wanted to be genocidal in Palestine,
it's over real quick.
A couple of well-timed nuclear bombs would end Gaza as we know it forever. That would be genocide. All right. So I just would like us to go back to our primers and be judicious in the use of our language, a word like genocide. Yeah. But I recognize that the boat may have well and truly left the port on that one in the West. So there you go.
You and I talked a couple of weeks ago about the evolution of language, and we were talking about it in a different context, but we created the term genocide to recognize the fact that something new and awful had been born out of the Holocaust and the Second World War. And in recent years, when people like you or I and some of our colleagues, particularly at the National Post at the time, when we would have been writing about the use of genocide in reference to missing and murdered Indigenous women, you and I would have been quick to point out, you know what's happening with these women is appalling. And I actually don't have any objection to saying that colonial policy to Indigenous peoples in North America was, historically speaking, genocidal. Like, I think that fits. But when
I also don't have the problem with the term cultural genocide, by the way. I think that cultural genocide
more complicated, but yeah, okay.
Complicated, but if you put cultural genocide, I think is I could accept that.
Yeah. I think, though, when it's never the popular position to be saying this thing is awful, but we don't need to expand the terms for our most awful things to cover it. We can condemn it on its own merits.
Yeah.
We can condemn the murder of these Indigenous women as being awful because Indigenous women are being murdered. We don't need to draw in the language we created to cover the Holocaust here. And I'm not looking to start a different debate about that, because I think you and I are on the same page that Indigenous peoples in this country have absolutely been shafted and they deserve way the fuck better. But I think when we've been seeing this here in this country, and I think others have made this point out before us, when the Prime Minister of Canada would, on the one hand, acknowledge that he is leading a genocidal state, and on the other hand, be announcing plans to celebrate its birthday party on July 1st, it didn't reveal a lack of seriousness on Mr. Trudeau's part, and it didn't reveal anything about the country. What it revealed is that we no longer took the word genocide seriously.
Yeah, essentially, in our desire to make the worst aspects of our own history seem, or to attribute them, give them an emotive punch, a new emotive punch, we've actually had the effect of denigrating the capacity of these words to actually have any emotional impact at all.
This is going to be a strange saying that someone will probably clip and use against me on Twitter, but I'm a genocide absolutist. Like, I believe genocide should mean
definitely that is the one that people are going to clip on put on Twitter to use against you.
I think so, but by a genocide absolutist, and this is the part that will not make the clip, I think we need to stick to the definition of it as a deliberate effort to destroy in whole or in part an identifiable group of people. And cultural genocide, I think that's trickier. I understand the argument in favor of that being a coherent term, but as a genocide absolutist, there it is again, you can gift me on that. I think it has to mean what it originally meant, which was the coordinated and organized effort to annihilate a people. Or, I mean, even there are even incidents, and believe me, I've been real popular when I've made this distinction. Not every act of ethnic cleansing is genocidal. Ethnic cleansing is its own thing, and it's also fucking awful. But there are times, and I remember talking years and years ago, with a Canadian military officer who'd been on the NATO rotations in the Balkans. And I had said to him, are the Balkans going to have to be a place we just go back to every 20 years and get them to stop massacring each other? And he went, nope. And I said, why? And he says, because it's ethnically cleansed. He says the nation states that emerged out of the collapse of Yugoslavia and the ethnic groups that made up the former Yugoslavia are now relatively contiguous. The Croats are in Croatia, the Serbs are in Serbia, the Bosnians are in Bosnia. Now, it's not perfect, of course, but he says those regions have been ethnically cleansed, and it was ugly and it was awful. But his prediction was that region would probably actually begin to recover now. So I'm like, when we talk about these terms, they mean specific things. And I believe we can't discuss these serious issues unless we know what genocide means, unless we know what ethnic cleansing means, unless we know what proportionality and military conflict means. Most of the people running around saying these things don't know what they mean. And at least
on that note, so like and subscribe to The Line. We have
where we are proud genocide absolutists. Yeah.
Okay, so I've got 5 more minutes before I have to go pick up Jamie. You wanted to talk about this Biden quote, so let's get to it real quick.
Yeah, give me 1 second to do that, because I'm actually going to read it verbatim. So I'm going to pull it up on my phone.
Okay. Do I need to make more C words while you do that to cover for you?
No, I should.
Time?
I have it on my phone. Here it is. Yeah, I flagged it earlier for easy access.
There we go.
The president yesterday was meeting with leaders from Latin America, some sort of America-wide conference. I think the prime minister is actually heading down there today for it. So it's a confab, C word, of all of these American, like Western Hemisphere leaders. And at the end of an Oval Office meeting with like the president of Chile, the president, almost as an aside, made a comment, and I'm going to read it verbatim. And there was a bit of crosstalk between the president and the president of Chile, but basically at the end of their meeting where they're talking about like trade policy and better ties between America and Chile, the president said, there comes a time, maybe every 6 or 8 generations, where the world changes in a very short time. And then the Chilean president kind of nodded and said, yes, we're living through one of those moments now. And the president said, I think we are. I think what happens in the next 2 to 3 years is going to determine what the world looks like for the next 5 or 6 decades. And it came out of nowhere, the president's comments. It was like, hey, great to have you here. Let's talk agricultural policies. And also, and what it just kind of jumped out at me, it was not a scripted moment by the president. We were kind of lucky that it happened to be caught by the White House pool, who was there recording the handshakes at the end of the meeting. Is the president reading the line? Because what have we been trying to hammer home to people for the last 3 years? Things are changing. Things are changing.
C word.
Change. Yeah. And
not changing in the good, hopey way. Changing in the dark way.
You know, as grim as I've been the last few weeks, because we're going through some shit here as a world, and I want to refer people back to my Expectations Are a Problem column from almost 2 years ago, because expectations being a problem is not necessarily a pessimistic position, and it's not necessarily a defeatist position. What it is an understanding that we have to understand that things are changing and we have to be nimble. And it was interesting to me to see that the president gets that, because I think if that's rattling around his brain enough that it just sort of pops out in the middle of an Oval Office meeting with the president of Chile, it's obviously on his mind. And if you look at what the president's been doing in recent years with Ukraine armaments, with backstopping Israel, with taking on Russia and China, the president seems to be seized with it. And you can criticize him for what he's done or what he's not done, blah, blah, blah. But I thought it was really interesting to hear him say that. And we hear Canadian officials say it all the time, but they don't fucking mean it. Because Melanie Joly this week announcing her new Canadian foreign policy. It's a tough world out there. And I'm reading all of her remarks and I'm thinking, these are the guys who want us to believe how seized they are with the urgency of adapting to a changing world order. And they're also looking to trim $1 billion over 4 years out of the defense budget.
You know, I should really write my next column about those Julie comments, because I actually have a dark take on that. But on that note, I have to go.
Yeah, you got to go.
I got to go.
You got to go get your kid.
I told you this, did I tell you last time I was late to pick up Jamie, and he looked at me and he said, Mommy, when you pick me up late, it makes me think you don't care about me.
Wow. Shots fired.
Right?
When I pick my kids up from school, they look at me and they're like, oh, Dad's here. Like my kids are old enough now to walk themselves home, right? And we live pretty close to school, but I like to walk over once in a while, see what they're up to. And when I show up, they're like almost mildly bent out of shape about it. But Jamie, yeah, wow, guilt bomb. All right, well, look, go get your son.
He didn't even mean it that way. He didn't manipulate me or anything. He was just like, literally, Mommy, that's how I feel, and I'm expressing how I feel to you. And I'm like, that's actually really mature.
Harsh,
like,
but also harsh.
Well, yeah, I got him McDonald's. It was fine. Anyway, goodbye.
Goodbye,
love
everybody.
You
Thanks.
online, people.
Like, subscribe.
Know that we love you in our hearts.
We do. Thanks, everybody.